In Ireland, a violent criminal called Barbie Kardashian has been jailed for 5.5 years for threatening to rape and torture his own mother. But there's a catch. He's going to be jailed in a women's prison because he identifies as a woman, and under Ireland's self-identification law, which was signed in 2015, he has the right to do that. Now, the Irish Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, said he was surprised to hear about this case and said he might potentially even change the law to do something about this. Rakib, should he have been so surprised, given how common this is across the Western world?
Well, I'm surprised that he's surprised. These in the Republic of Ireland, these gender self-identification rules, as you said, were introduced back in 2015. It's not a new bit of legislation, put it that way. I think for me, though, that his position though is correct. By the way, that this individual should clearly not be in a woman's prison facility. It's clear as day, and I think that this is very similar to the Isle of Bryson episode in Scotland.
Yeah.
And I think that what we're seeing here is that exceptionally flexible forms of gender self-identification, they're unraveling. I think that's what we're seeing here, and for me, I've made this point many times before. If someone wants to identify with a particular gender, they shouldn't be discriminated against. They should be treated with respect and dignity. What they shouldn't expect, though, is that for their self-identification to be recognised, legally recognised, and for it to be recognised in such a way that they can essentially decide which sex-based prison that they can be placed into. I think that you really have to draw the line, and I think that's where I do draw the line. That when it comes to prison, the criminal justice system, for example, a woman is adult biological female. There's no gay, and quite equally for me, a man is an adult biological male. And I think when you start trying to think about it too deeply, that's when you start making mistakes. I just think you need to set very simple, clear boundaries when it comes to this kind of situation.
And I should probably just say a bit more about Barbie Kardashian in particular. It's quite gruesome. If you're eating your dinner while you're listening to this show, pause for a moment, because this is someone who not only threatened to rape and torture his own mother, he had also raped his own mother with his father. He had been arrested he had been previously charged with all kinds of assault. He assaulted one of his social workers by tearing out clumps of her hair, tore her eyelid. I mean, the extreme kind of violence is almost unthinkable, and yet somehow these dimwits in the state think that this is appropriate to put him in a woman's prison.
And it's that inability to see that this would be the inevitable consequence of this sort of thing, which is so striking. The other thing, and you've both already touched on it, is the way in which time and time again you have political leaders who either refuse to acknowledge or to have any knowledge of the obvious downsides, to put it lightly, the obvious horrendous situations which are created by policy like gender self-ID, as happened with Nicola Sturgeon, say, or in Leo Varadkar's case, just kind of willful ignorance, it seems like, about what is actually happening. It's a feature that you see happen time and time again. You even, by the way, see it in relation to what's been happening in England, because one thing that was, I imagine, slightly confusing for those who weren't following it as closely in all its grisly details in terms of this debate that we tend to, is the fact that you had, for instance, cases that had happened in England, which does not have gender self-ID laws and which to the same extent of what Scotland was proposing, and yet there had already been situations in which male convicted sex offenders, rapists, paedophiles, you name it, had been placed in the women's estate.
Essentially because our institutions had taken up self-ID even when the law hadn't.
And that's where these laws come from in the first place anyway, is the fact that a handful of quangos and charities and so on have basically said, this is the right policy, this is what makes you a good person, could you please implement it? And these idiots go and do it. But like, as you say, exactly, these things had already become sort of implemented de facto anyway. And this is one of those things which really mystifies the debate, because you often bring these people up and be like, oh, that's not true.
It can't be true. It's so mad.
And yet it is. And I think Varadkar's had his own awakening, it seems like, in this particular case. We'll see if he actually does anything about it. But it's maddening, especially when you take a case like this, not only because of the gruesome crimes that Barbie Kardashian has both been accused of and has actually been convicted of. Not only the obvious inappropriateness of this, also we're not talking here about a question of gender self-ID and a kind of question about someone who's been struggling with their gender identity. This is a depraved and disturbed individual. I have no idea why he now identifies as a woman, whether that is something that he's been harbouring from a young age, or especially given the fact that both in name and appearance he presents an almost absurd caricature of female presentation. That there's something else going on here. But regardless of that, it is not a good idea to have someone with that rap sheet in a women's prison. That should be obvious to almost anyone. And yet, as Rakib was suggesting, people are tying themselves in knots, citing studies that they barely understand, about trying to suggest that actually it's fine. Because if you provide the right safeguards and so on, this never happens. If it never happened, then we wouldn't be talking about these stories every couple of weeks. And yet we are. So it's remarkable. I think that on this issue, more than anything else in the gender issue, anything else in the whole culture more broadly, is how people who claim to be fonts of wisdom and expertise and have listened to all the right opinions, who've done the research, who've done the work and so on, are complete blithering idiots when the reality that this is about idea is staring them in the face. If this issue doesn't prove that the supposed smart set are not smart at all, then this is surely it.
Yeah, and Rakib, I mean, I think it's fair to say that this was the issue that brought down Nicola Sturgeon. Do you think other politicians like Varadkar are finally getting a bit of a fright? You know, are they seeing how insane their own policies are, or at least seeing, you know, how badly the public are reacting, quite rightly, to them?
I think so. I think that the political downfall of Nicola Sturgeon, that was very much a warning shot for many so-called progressive politicians in much of the Western world, if truth be told. I think Varadkar's been very firm. To be fair, he was asked the question, he gave a very clear answer. But then what's he going to do now? Because these rules are in place when it comes to gender self-identification in Ireland. Is he going to look to reverse that in any way, shape or form? So it's one thing saying that, no, this isn't right. This particular individual should not be located in a women's prison. But what are you going to do about it to prevent that from taking place from a legal perspective? That's what I'd like to see now.
Yeah, and you do sort of see in the sort of SNP context, you'd have the likes of Humza Yousaf, the continuity candidate, saying, actually, no, we'll press on with the gender recognition bill. Oh, I understand the Isla Bryson case is wrong, but I still agree with the principle of self-ID. How do people square that circle?
Well, I think they want to present this as essentially, I guess it's the bad apples argument around putting male sex offenders in women's prisons.
They're not real trans people, they're faking it or something.
Yeah, which is, again, making these sorts of distinctions they wouldn't previously. I mean, it's been even interesting that you've seen a shift in relation to people like Humza Yousaf being willing to say, maybe this individual who's just been convicted of double rape and has decided that he's female halfway through his trial, maybe he's not actually legitimately transgender and it's okay to misgender him in this particular situation, or at least call his trans identification into question. That's actually almost been quite a radical change of position for them. So down the trans rabbit hole they actually were in so many respects. But I think the thing that's important to stress about this is that the reason sex-based rights exist is not because all men are violent sex offenders. It's not because all trans people are violent sex offenders. There's one smear that people on the other side of this argument try to say is that the reason that you're talking about these cases of these individuals, whether they're genuinely trans or not, who found themselves in situations where they could exploit sex-based rights for their own depraved benefit. You're trying to suggest that trans people are sex offenders. Far from it. I don't believe most of these people are trans, for instance. I think they're quite clearly exploiting a loophole that idiots have given them in order to access vulnerable women. And the important thing about sex-based rights is that it's not based on the assumption that most men are wrong-uns or that most trans people are wrong-uns. It's just the fact that it's a blanket protection which provides dignity and a level of safety for women and girls in situations in which they would otherwise be vulnerable. It's the height of common sense when you think about it for about 5 seconds. And yet, for whatever reason, it's a concept that the supposedly most educated people in society struggle with endlessly in public, embarrassing themselves. And you hope with the remarkably crisp comments from Varadkar this week, at least by comparison, that's starting to change at least a little bit.